The Long Afternoon. Chapter 1. The Silence. The laboratory had hummed. For 37 years, it had filled my ears with the whisper of ventilation systems, the beep of centrifuges, the purposeful click of keyboards. Now standing in Emily's kitchen. Our kitchen, I reminded myself. The only sound was the tick of a clock I'd never noticed before. Tea? Emily asked, already filling the kettle. I checked my watch. 10:47 a.m. It's not yet. I stopped. Not yet what? Not yet time for my scheduled break? There were no more schedules. Retirement had arrived like a door slamming shut. One day I was Dr. James Williams, lead researcher in molecular biology with a team of 12 researchers depending on my guidance. The next, I was simply James, a man standing in a country kitchen with absolutely nothing to do. The retirement party had been 3 weeks ago. Speeches about my contributions to the field, a plaque with my name engraved in neat letters, cake that tasted like cardboard in my mouth. My colleagues had seemed genuinely sorry to see me go, which somehow made it worse. Dr. Davies, who'd been my graduate student 20 years ago, had gripped my shoulder and said, "You've earned this rest, James. Enjoy it." Rest. The word felt like a life sentence. Emily set a cup before me, steam curling upward. She'd barely changed, I thought, studying her properly for perhaps the first time in years. The same intelligent eyes, though there were lines at the corners now. When had those appeared? Her hair was more gray than brown now, cut shorter than I remembered. She moved through the kitchen with the easy familiarity of someone who'd lived here alone for a very long time. Because she had lived here alone. I'd moved to that apartment near the university 7 years ago, telling myself it was temporary, just until the grant project finished. Then another grant, another project, another reason to stay close to the lab. "I have my book club this afternoon," she said lightly, "then dinner with the Patels at 6. "Again?" The word came out sharper than intended. "You were out yesterday, and the day before?" "Well, yes." She smiled, unbothered. "Would you like to come? The Patels would love to." I don't see the point of sitting around making small talk about nothing. I stood restless. My body wanted to move, to do, to accomplish something. I should organize my office, sort through my research notes. There might be data worth publishing from the last study. Emily's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Of course. I spent the afternoon arranging papers that didn't need arranging, reading journals about research I was no longer conducting. My old office at the university had been reassigned within a week. Dr. Davies sat at my desk now, leading my team, pursuing my research directions. Life at the laboratory had continued without me, barely pausing to notice I was gone. Through the window, I watched Emily leave in that colorful scarf she always wore, the one that made her look like a visiting artist instead of a retired teacher. She walked with purpose, her step light. Going towards something? While I sat here with nothing ahead of me but empty hours. The house grew dark around me. I didn't turn on the lights. In the laboratory, the lights had been automatic, sensors detecting presence and motion. Here, darkness simply accumulated until you chose to push it back. I didn't choose. I just sat there, surrounded by papers about work I'd never finish, listening to the clock tick away a retirement I hadn't wanted and didn't know how to fill. Chapter 2. The Invitation That Never Came. 3 weeks into retirement, I'd established a routine. Wake at 6 a.m., the body remembers. Breakfast alone. Emily was never an early riser then. Nothing. Hours of nothing, stretching like an empty corridor. I tried to fill the time productively. I read every scientific journal I could access. I wrote lengthy emails to former colleagues. offering suggestions on their ongoing projects. Most responded politely but briefly. They were busy with the work I no longer had. I attempted to write a book about my research, something I'd always told myself I'd do when I had time. But sitting at the computer, I found I had nothing to say that hadn't already been said in papers and conferences. My career, reduced to words on a screen, seemed smaller than it had felt while living it. Emily fluttered in and out like a hummingbird. Pottery class on Mondays, gardening club on Wednesdays, volunteering at the library on Fridays. Always moving, always busy, always somewhere else. She'd leave in the morning with her canvas tote bag full of mysterious purposes, and return in the evening glowing with stories about people I'd never met. Community theater is doing our town, she mentioned one morning over breakfast. They're looking for volunteers to help build sets. I thought you might. I'm a scientist, Emily, not a carpenter. It's just hammering some wood together. It might be fun. She was using that carefully cheerful tone, the one that meant she was trying not to push too hard. Fun. I tested the word like a foreign phrase. I have important work to review. The Peterson study on protein synthesis. I need to read their methodology section again. I think they might have made an error in their control group. You're not on the team anymore, James. The truth of it struck like a slap. She was right, of course. I was no longer on any team. Dr. Peterson could make all the errors she wanted, and it was no longer my responsibility to catch them. I was simply here. Emily looked at me for a long moment, something sad flickering across her face. Then she picked up her plate and carried it to the sink. After that conversation, she stopped mentioning her activities directly. She'd leave notes instead. Out with Susan. Leftover casserole in fridge. At choir practice. Back by 9. The house filled with these small paper messages, her way of accounting for her absence without actually talking to me about it. I told myself I preferred it this way. No interruptions, no pointless socializing. I could focus on what exactly? I started watching the clock, waiting for her to come home. Not because I missed her company. I'd been fine without it for years, hadn't I? But because her presence meant the house felt less empty. Even if we barely spoke, even if she went straight to her studio or the garden, at least there was another person breathing the same air. One evening in late October, she came home laughing, her cheeks pink from the cold. Someone named David had apparently told a hilarious story about mistaking salt for sugar at a charity bake sale, creating cupcakes so salty that Mrs. Henderson had nearly choked. Emily tried to explain it to me, still giggling, her eyes bright in a way I'd forgotten they could be. I couldn't muster the energy to pretend I cared about David or his baking mishaps. "You're never home," I said instead. The words came out accusatory, bitter. Emily's laughter died. She set down her purse slowly, carefully, like she was handling something fragile. "I'm inviting you to join me less and less because you always say no, James. What would you have me do? Sit here in silence with you? I just don't understand how you can waste so much time on these trivial pursuits. David's baking disasters. Theater sets. Book clubs where you probably just talk about your feelings instead of analyzing the actual literature. And what are you doing that's so important?" Her voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it I rarely heard. Sitting alone reading journals about research you're not conducting anymore? Writing emails to people who are too polite to tell you to let go? The words hit harder because they were true. I stood there, feeling exposed and angry and helpless all at once. "I just don't understand how you can be so happy," I said finally. "You're retired too. How are you not?" I couldn't finish the sentence. Empty. Useless. Lost. Something flickered across her face. Hurt, perhaps, or anger, or maybe something more complicated than either. But she only said, "They're not trivial to me," and went upstairs. I sat alone in the living room, listening to the clock tick. Above me, I could hear Emily moving around, the soft sounds of her evening routine. Getting ready for bed in the room we technically shared, but where we mostly just slept side by side like strangers in a hotel. At some point, the sound stopped. The house fell completely silent, and I realized I'd been sitting in the dark for hours, unable to find a reason to move. Chapter 3. The Conversation. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in early November. I'd spent the morning trying to write an article for a popular science magazine. The editor had emailed me months ago, back when I still had my title, asking if I'd be interested in contributing. I'd finally responded, desperate for something that felt like purpose. But every sentence I wrote sounded pretentious or oversimplified. I'd deleted more than I'd kept. Emily came downstairs around noon, fresh from the shower, already dressed to go out. That colorful scarf again. The one I'd bought her 15 years ago on a conference trip to India. I'd forgotten I'd given it to her. Strange how she'd kept it all this time. "I'm meeting Susan for lunch, then we're going to the art supply store," she said, checking her reflection in the hallway mirror. "There's soup in the... Do you even want me here?" The words tumbled out, rough and unplanned. I hadn't meant to say them. Hadn't even known I was thinking them until they were hanging in the air between us. Emily froze, her hands still on the scarf. "What? Do you even want me here?" I repeated, standing now, something cracking open inside my chest. "You're always gone, always with other people. Susan and David and the Patels and people whose names I don't even know. You have this whole life that doesn't include me. Did you even notice when I moved back? Or is it just more convenient having someone to leave notes for?" "James, everyone loves you," I continued, my voice rising despite myself. Years of unspoken things suddenly demanding to be heard. "Tom from the library committee, Mrs. Rodriguez from your book club, that couple from the gardening club, the Hendersons, is it? They all light up when they see you. You walk into a room and suddenly it's warmer, more alive. People want to be near you. They choose you." I sank onto the couch, all the anger draining out as quickly as it had risen, leaving only exhaustion in its wake. And I spent 37 years being useful, being needed. I was good at what I did, Emily. Really good. People depended on me. My research mattered. And now I'm just empty. I wake up and there's nothing. No one needs me. No one even wants me around. Not even you. The silence stretched. I couldn't look at her, couldn't bear to see confirmation of what I'd just said in her eyes. Then the couch shifted as she sat beside me. Not touching, but close. Close enough that I could smell her lavender soap, the scent that had always meant home, even when home was just a weekend visit between conferences. "You're not empty," she said quietly. "I don't know how to do this, how to be this person with nothing to contribute. In the lab, I knew who I was. I was Dr. Williams, lead researcher, mentor, scientist. Out here, I'm just no one." "James." She turned to face me fully, and I finally looked up. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. Not quite. "You've always contributed. You've done important work. But people, they've always valued you too, not just your research. You just never stopped long enough to notice." "That's not true. Isn't it?" Her voice was gentle but firm. "Mrs. Rodriguez asks about you every single week. How is your husband adjusting? Is he settling in? Would he ever be interested in talking to the library group? She remembers that paper you published on enzyme inhibitors, the one in Nature 5 years ago. She read it because her grandson is studying biology, and she wanted to understand what he was learning. She keeps it in her desk drawer, James. Your work. I stared at her, unable to process this information. Tom wants to know if you'd be interested in talking to the library's science book club, she continued, not giving a formal lecture. Just talking? Sharing what you find fascinating. He thinks you could make complex ideas accessible to people who never got to take advanced science classes. He said, and I'm quoting here, someone that passionate about his work must be incredible to learn from. I don't understand. Why didn't you tell me this? I tried to, she said simply, but you'd already decided that everything I do is trivial, that the people I spend time with are wasting their lives on shallow pursuits. Why would you listen? The accusation stung because it was accurate. The Hendersons grow orchids, Emily continued. Did you know that? Robert has been trying to hybridize different species for years. He's read everything he can find, but he's not a scientist. He's an accountant who fell in love with flowers. And he'd love, to discuss the biology of hybridization with someone who actually understands genetics and heredity, and all the things he's teaching himself from books. I didn't know any of this. Because you never asked. You assumed that because these people aren't in laboratories or universities, because they're just living their lives in this small town, they must not be curious or intelligent or worth your time. I felt something crack deeper, a foundation I hadn't known I'd built. I've been an ass. Yes, she agreed, but her voice was kind. But you've also been lost and scared. And I understand that, James. I do. We sat in silence for a moment. Outside, a car drove past. Normal life continuing as it always did, indifferent to the small catastrophes happening in living rooms and kitchens across the world. You think what I do is trivial, Emily said finally. But these people, they're not shallow, James. They're just living. Learning things, trying things, connecting with each other. There's value in that too. Not the kind that gets published in journals or wins grants, but value nonetheless. The kind that makes life feel like it's worth living. I looked down at my hands. Scientists' hands, I'd always thought, but now they just looked old. Spotted, veiny, the joints starting to swell with the first hints of arthritis. How had I never noticed? I don't know if I can do it. Step out there. I've forgotten how to be anything except a researcher. If I ever knew it all. Emily took one of those hands in both of hers, her grip warm and solid. Then start small. Come to the Hendersons' dinner on Friday. Just that. You can talk about orchids or sit quietly and listen. No pressure. No performance. Just try. I met her eyes, seeing something there I'd missed in my years of distraction. Patience, yes, but also a kind of loneliness that mirrored my own. She'd been living parallel to me all these years, not with me. We'd been two people sharing a name and an address, but little else. Will you stay? I asked, the question containing multitudes. Will you stay at dinner? Will you stay married to me? Will you stay in my life even though I've been absent from yours? Yes, she said, understanding all of it. If you'll actually be here. Not just physically present, but really here. Okay, I whispered. I'll try. She squeezed my hand. That's all I'm asking. Later that evening, after Emily had left for her lunch and shopping with Susan, I sat at my computer. But instead of opening another journal or trying to force words into that article, I wrote an email to Tom at the library. Just a short note, saying I'd be interested in talking to the book club if the offer was still open. Nothing formal, just conversation. Before I could second-guess myself, I hit send. The reply came within an hour. James, that's wonderful. The group meets every other Thursday. Would November 21st work? We're reading Mary Roach's Stiff. Lots of questions about biology and decomposition that I definitely can't answer. Tom. I wrote back, November 21st is perfect. Looking forward to it. And the strange thing was, I meant it. Chapter 4. Small Steps. Friday arrived with the weight of expectation. I changed my shirt 3 times, finally settling on the blue button-down Emily said brought out my eyes. She didn't comment on my nervousness, just smiled and handed me a bottle of wine to bring. The Hendersons' dining room smelled like rosemary and garlic. I'd spent the entire car ride rehearsing conversations in my head, feeling like a teenager going to his first party. What if I had nothing to say? What if they regretted inviting me? What if I'd forgotten how to make conversation about anything except enzymatic reactions and cellular respiration? James! Robert Henderson shook my hand warmly, his grip firm and welcoming. He was younger than I'd expected. Probably mid-50s, with laugh lines around his eyes and soil permanently embedded under his fingernails. Emily says you might be interested in seeing the greenhouse. Oh, I wouldn't want to impose before dinner. Nonsense. Dinner's not for another hour. And I've been dying to show someone who might actually understand what I'm attempting. He was already leading me toward the back door, his enthusiasm infectious. Alice, that's my wife. She's very patient. But after 15 minutes of me talking about flower genetics, her eyes glaze over. And just like that, I was following him outside, listening to him explain his hybridization attempts with Phalaenopsis orchids. His greenhouse was modest but well organized, with careful labels on each pot, detailed journals of crossbreeding attempts, temperature and humidity logs. This is impressive, I said, genuinely meaning it. You're approaching this quite systematically. Robert beamed. I try, but I get stuck sometimes. Like, see this? He pointed to a plant with streaky purple and white flowers. This is a cross between a pink standard and a white species. I was hoping for a uniform light pink, but instead I got this streaking pattern. I've tried to understand the genetic mechanism, but the papers are. He trailed off, laughing. Let's just say they're written for people much smarter than me. May I? I pulled out my reading glasses, examining the flower more closely. The pattern was striking. Irregular streaks of pigment that suggested something interesting about gene expression. It's likely a result of variable pigment distribution. The genes for color are present, but they're not being expressed uniformly across the petal tissue. I mentioned something about anthocyanin biosynthesis and regulatory genes, and his eyes lit up. That's exactly what I've been wondering about. Can you explain? An hour passed. Then 2. We bent over his journals together, me sketching diagrams on a notepad Robert had provided, explaining concepts I hadn't thought about in years. Mendelian inheritance, dominant and recessive traits, the difference between genotype and phenotype. He asked thoughtful questions, made connections I hadn't expected, showed me crosses he'd attempted and results he'd observed. I'd forgotten this feeling. The pure joy of sharing knowledge with someone genuinely curious. In the laboratory, teaching had become rote, something I did between more important tasks. But here, watching Robert's face light up as concepts clicked into place, I remembered why I'd fallen in love with science in the first place. Not for the publications or the grants, but for this, the wonder of understanding how things work. I think dinner might be getting cold, Emily said from the doorway, smiling. How long had she been standing there? At the table, I found myself actually listening to the conversations flowing around me. Susan talked about the historical novel her book club was reading, Something about Victorian England and early female scientists. It's fiction, she said, but the author clearly did her research on the challenges women faced in academic settings back then. Still face them in many cases, Mrs. Rodriguez added quietly. Something stirred in my memory. There was a woman in my graduate program, I said slowly. Everyone turned to look at me, and I felt my face warm. Dr. Judith Warner, brilliant researcher, she solved a protein structure problem that had stumped our entire department. But she had to fight for every opportunity, every grant, every ounce of recognition. She's a department head now at Stanford, but it took her twice as long as it should have. What happened to her? Susan asked, leaning forward. And I told them about Dr. Warner's persistence, her brilliance, the elegant simplicity of her solution to a complex problem. I talked about the moment she presented her findings to the department, the stunned silence that followed, the grudging respect she'd finally earned. Emily watched me, her expression soft, as I discovered I could tell a story that wasn't just about data and methodology, but about a person. Later, Susan asked me about Marie Curie. Was her work as dangerous as people claimed? I found myself describing radioactive decay, the state of scientific knowledge at the time, why Curie couldn't have known the risks she was taking. She carried test tubes of radium in her pockets, I said. Thought it was beautiful, the way it glowed in the dark. By the time anyone understood the danger, the damage was already done. Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head. Passion and curiosity, she murmured. They can save us or kill us. Often both, I agreed. On the drive home, Emily was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet. Different from the silence that had filled our house for weeks. Thank you, I said. For what? For not giving up on me. For seeing something I couldn't see. I struggled to find the words. For knowing there was more than just the emptiness. She reached over and squeezed my hand. You were never empty, James. You just forgot you were more than your work. The next week, I attended the book club. I'd meant to just listen. But Mrs. Rodriguez asked me about the science in the Mary Roach book. And suddenly I was explaining decomposition, bacterial action, the surprising complexity of what happens to bodies after death. The conversation spiraled into questions about biology, medicine, the ethics of body donation to science. An hour flew by. You should come back, Tom said as we were leaving. Maybe not just for books. Would you consider doing a monthly science discussion? Nothing formal. Just whatever's interesting you, whatever you think people should know about. I thought about saying no. About all the reasons why I wasn't qualified anymore, wasn't current enough, wasn't... Yes, I heard myself say, I'd like that. Emily's pottery class met on Wednesday evenings in a converted barn on the edge of town. I'd driven her there a dozen times, but I'd never gone inside. This week I did. The instructor, a woman named Carol with clay permanently staining her hands, welcomed me with the casual ease of someone used to beginners. Ever worked with clay before? No, but I'd like to try. She set me up at a wheel next to Emily, showed me the basic technique for centering clay. It was harder than it looked. The clay fought back, wobbling and collapsing despite my best efforts. Beside me, Emily's hands moved with practiced confidence, coaxing the spinning earth into a bowl shape. You're thinking too hard, she said, not looking up from her work. Stop trying to control it. Just guide it. That's not very scientific. Exactly. I tried again, this time relaxing my grip, letting the clay move with the wheel instead of forcing it into submission. Slowly, improbably, it began to center. Not perfect, not smooth, but recognizably a cylinder instead of a lumpy disaster. There, Emily said, glancing over. See? You can do things that aren't scientific. We drove home with clay-stained hands, both of us slightly giddy with the accomplishment of making something with our hands instead of our minds. That evening, instead of retreating to separate corners of the house, we made dinner together. Something we hadn't done in years. Emily chopped vegetables while I managed the stove, both of us moving around the kitchen in an improvised dance, occasionally bumping into each other and laughing. "Tell me about Susan," I said as we ate. "How did you two become friends?" Emily looked surprised by the question. She moved here about 5 years ago. Her husband had just died. Cancer. And she didn't know anyone. I met her at the library, saw her crying over a book about grief, and just asked if she wanted coffee. That was kind of you. I knew what it felt like, she said quietly. To be alone. The words hung between us heavy with meaning. I'd been living at the apartment then, visiting only on weekends when my schedule allowed, which hadn't been often. "I'm sorry," I said, "for all those years, for not seeing." "I know." She reached across the table, taking my hand. "I'm sorry too, for not telling you I was lonely, for letting the distance grow because it seemed easier than fighting." We sat there in the kitchen, holding hands across the table, the remains of our meal growing cold around us. Starting over, or maybe starting for the first time. Some evenings after that, we went out together. The Patels for dinner, where I learned that Rajesh had been an engineer before retiring and had fascinating thoughts about the intersection of technology and biology. Other evenings, we stayed in, cooking dinner side by side, telling each other about our days. I learned that Emily had been taking watercolor classes and was quite good. Her paintings had a loose, expressive quality that captured mood better than literal representation. She learned that I'd always wondered about woodworking, so we signed up for a weekend workshop together at the community center. The workshop was humbling. My hands, so precise with pipettes and lab equipment, were clumsy with saws and chisels. I cut one dovetail joint backwards, causing the instructor to wince. Emily fared little better. Her bookshelf ended up with one shelf an inch higher than the other. We took a picture of our lopsided, imperfect projects, both of us grinning. "Should we keep them?" Emily asked. "Absolutely. Evidence that we tried something new." At the November book club meeting, I gave my first informal talk. Just 20 minutes. About antibiotic resistance, why it matters, how it works, what people can do. I expected boredom or polite attention. Instead, the questions went on for an hour. People wanted to know about their own health, their families, the news they'd heard. They wanted to understand. Walking to the car afterward, Tom caught up with me. "That was incredible, James. Would you consider doing this monthly? We have a small budget. We could pay you a bit, cover materials if you want to do demonstrations." "You don't need to pay me," I said, surprised by how much I meant it. It felt good. Feeling useful again. "You were always useful," Tom said simply. "You just needed to find a different place to be useful." I still miss the laboratory sometimes. Miss the sense of pushing at the boundaries of human knowledge, of solving puzzles that mattered on a grand scale. Late at night, I'd sometimes dream I was back there, pipetting samples, checking data, the familiar rhythm of research flowing through me. But I was discovering that there were other kinds of puzzles, other ways to contribute. Teaching curious library patrons about science, helping them understand the world around them in new ways. Learning about orchid cultivation from Robert, who approached his hobby with the dedication of any scientist. Understanding finally how to be present in my own life. Instead of always rushing toward the next breakthrough, the next publication, the next grant deadline. That afternoon with Robert in the greenhouse, explaining genetic inheritance and watching his face light up with understanding. That had felt important too. Different from the laboratory, but no less real. The moment at book club when Mrs. Rodriguez said, "Oh, that's why the doctor prescribes the full course of antibiotics even when I feel better." And I could see the concept clicking into place. That was its own kind of discovery. One morning in early December, I woke before the alarm and realized I was looking forward to the day. Really looking forward to it. Emily and I were visiting a botanical garden an hour away, something she'd wanted to do for months. Then we were meeting the Patels and the Hendersons for lunch at a new restaurant. Simple things, perhaps. Ordinary pleasures. I turned over and saw Emily still sleeping, her face peaceful in the morning light. Later, I'd make her coffee the way she liked it. Something I'd never taken the time to learn in all our years together. We'd drive to the gardens, and she'd point out plants I'd never noticed. And I'd tell her their Latin names and interesting facts about their biology, and somehow both kinds of knowing would matter. For the first time in months, I wasn't counting the hours until I could be useful again. I was already useful. Already here. Already home. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything.
Chapter 5. What She Carried. Emily's perspective. I heard James moving around in the kitchen. The unfamiliar sound of him preparing breakfast at a reasonable hour, instead of rushing out the door at dawn. Through the bedroom window, the morning light was soft, gentle. Everything felt gentle lately. But it hadn't always been that way. People thought James was the one who needed saving when he retired. The brilliant scientist suddenly unmoored, lost without his laboratory. They'd smile at me sympathetically at book club, at the grocery store, at pottery class. "How is James doing?" they'd ask, their voices pitched with concern. "It must be so hard for him. You're being so patient with him." No one asked how I was doing. The truth was, I'd been drowning for years. Drowning in a marriage that existed on paper, but not in practice. Drowning in loneliness so profound that I'd forgotten it wasn't normal. It started gradually, his absence. First, the late nights at the lab, which I understood. Important research, pressing deadlines, the pressure of grant renewals. I was a teacher. I understood professional dedication. Then the weekends disappeared, one by one. "Just this one Saturday, Emily. The data collection window is closing." Then the dinner table conversations, where he was physically present, but mentally still in the laboratory, his mind working through problems I couldn't help him solve. Then he moved to that apartment closer to work, and I told myself it made sense. It was temporary, it was for his career. We'd see each other on weekends. We'd make it work. Except the weekends became every other weekend. Then once a month. Then holidays only. Then just his birthday and mine. Quick visits where he seemed distracted and eager to leave. Back to the work that mattered more than I did. I woke up one day and realized I'd been alone for most of my marriage. More than that, I'd been erased. Slowly, systematically, like a photograph left in the sun until the image fades to nothing. So I filled the emptiness. Book clubs, dinner parties, volunteer work, pottery classes, gardening club, choir practice, anything to avoid coming home to an empty house and admitting how lonely I was, how much I'd failed at the one thing I'd wanted most. A partnership, a companion, someone to share life with. I said yes to every invitation, joined every committee, became the woman everyone knew but nobody really knew. I became Emily Williams, retired teacher, friendly neighbor, the woman who showed up. Always showed up, always smiled, always available. Because if I stopped moving, I'd have to feel how much it hurt. The socializing wasn't joyful. It was survival. Oh, some people were genuine. Susan, the Patels, Mrs. Rodriguez. Susan, especially. When I met her at the library that day, crying over her grief book, I'd recognized something in her face. The same hollowness I saw in my own mirror. We became friends because we both understood what it meant to lose someone, while, in my case, they were still alive. Her husband to cancer, mine to his work. Different kinds of absence, but absence nonetheless. But others? I heard the whispers at the library fundraiser last spring. I'd gone to the bathroom, heard voices from the hallway. Emily Williams is here again. Doesn't she have anything better to do? Poor thing, her husband basically abandoned her for his precious research. Linda's voice, sweet as poison. Well, some women just can't keep their husbands interested, can they? I'd stood there, one hand on the bathroom door, unable to move. Unable to breathe. At book club, Linda had smiled sweetly and said, "It must be so freeing, having a marriage with so much independence. Charles is always underfoot. I'm so jealous of all your personal time." The other women had laughed, but I'd seen the pity in their eyes. They knew. Everyone knew my marriage was a polite fiction, maintained through Christmas cards, and the pretense that my husband and I were still anything more than strangers sharing a last name. The words had stung like paper cuts. Small but sharp, accumulating until I could barely feel anything else. But the next week, I'd gone to Linda's dinner party anyway. And the week after that, her book club. Because what else did I know how to do? I was Emily Williams, the woman who showed up. If I stopped showing up, who would I be? When James retired and actually came back, moved his boxes into the bedroom we'd barely shared, set up his office in the spare room, stood in my kitchen looking lost. I'd expected to feel relieved. Happy even. Finally, my husband was coming home. Instead, I felt crowded, invaded. Here was this man I'd married 38 years ago, suddenly present in my carefully constructed life, criticizing the very things that had kept me afloat. Time wasting, he'd called my activities, trivial pursuits. As if the life I'd built from the scraps of our marriage was somehow less valuable than his research papers. Each dismissal felt like confirmation that he'd never really seen me at all. After all these years, I was still invisible to him. Just the wife, the background character in the story of his brilliant career. The evening he finally broke down, I felt a shock of recognition. Here was James, asking if I even wanted him there, wondering why I was always gone. The same questions I'd asked myself for years, standing alone in our empty house, wondering if my husband even remembered he had a wife. He was feeling exactly what I'd felt for years. Invisible. Unnecessary. Adrift in a life that seemed to be happening around him, instead of with him. I comforted him, because I knew those words to say. I'd spoken them to myself countless times, trying to convince my reflection that I mattered, that my life had meaning beyond being Dr. James Williams' absent wife. But I hadn't believed they'd work. James was a workaholic. People didn't change, not really. I'd learned that lesson over decades of waiting for him to choose me, just once, over his laboratory. I'd told him about the others. Mrs. Rodriguez asking about him, Tom wanting his input, the Hendersons hoping to discuss orchids. I'd said the words to comfort him, to show him he wasn't as invisible as he felt. But saying them out loud, hearing myself list all those people who genuinely cared about James, who valued him beyond his professional achievements, something shifted in me. Because if they could see value in James the person, not just Dr. Williams the scientist, If Mrs. Rodriguez could keep his paper out of genuine interest, if Tom could want his knowledge shared rather than hoarded, if the Hendersons could seek real intellectual exchange, then maybe, just maybe, when some of these same people asked about me, showed interest in my watercolors, invited me to things, it wasn't all performance either. Maybe not everyone was like Linda with her veiled insults. Maybe some of them actually wanted to know me, not just fill a seat at their table. I'd been so busy protecting myself from rejection, assuming everyone was shallow because it hurt less than risking real connection. But I'd also been so busy being the woman who showed up, who facilitated and smiled and organized, that I'd never actually let anyone see the real Emily underneath. How could they value something I'd never shown them? Maybe I'd been the one keeping everyone at arm's length, convinced that no one could possibly want to know the real me. Convinced that my only worth was in being useful, being pleasant, being there. The same trap James had fallen into with his work. We'd both been hiding, just in different ways. Then I watched James take his first tentative steps out into the world I'd built. Watched him awkward and uncertain at the Hendersons' dinner, like a man learning to walk after an injury. Gradually relaxing as he found common ground, discovered he could talk about things he loved without being judged or dismissed. Saw him actually listening at book club, contributing thoughts instead of dismissing everyone else's as trivial. Noticed him staying present during conversations, choosing connection even when it felt uncomfortable, even when his instinct was probably to retreat to his office and the familiar safety of scientific journals. If James could change, could I? The question terrified me, because changing meant admitting I'd been wrong, meant risking real connection again, opening myself to the possibility of rejection, of discovering that, yes, maybe Linda was right, and I really was just a boring woman whose husband had better things to do than be with her. But it also meant the possibility of something better, something real. I started saying no. First to Linda's parties, where I'd always felt like I was being evaluated and found wanting. It felt impossibly difficult. That first, "No, thank you, I can't make it." Linda had sounded surprised, almost offended. "But you always come," she'd said. And I'd heard the subtext, "What else do you have to do?" "I'm having dinner with my husband," I'd said, and felt a small, fierce satisfaction when the words were true. Then I said no to committees that drained rather than fulfilled me, to coffee dates that left me feeling emptier than before, to the exhausting performance of being Emily Williams, the woman who shows up. I said yes differently, too. Yes to deeper conversations with Susan about more than just books, about grief and loneliness, and what it means to rebuild a life. Yes to inviting Mrs. Rodriguez for afternoon tea, asking about her grandson, her life, discovering that she'd been a nurse for 40 years and had stories that made my teaching career seem tame. Yes to asking the Patels about their experience immigrating here, the challenges they'd faced, the home they'd built despite everything. Stories I'd never thought to request, because I'd been too busy performing friendship to risk real intimacy. The watercolor class had started as another box to check, another thing to do so I wouldn't have to go home. But when I stopped treating it as obligation and actually let myself experiment with color and light, stopped worrying whether I was good enough, whether it mattered, I found something that felt like joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy in watching pigment bloom across wet paper, in the surprise of colors blending in unexpected ways, in creating something that existed simply because I wanted it to exist. And James, who'd been my husband in name but a stranger in practice, was slowly becoming a partner. We were learning each other again. Or perhaps truly for the first time. Learning that we both valued depth over surface, That we'd both been performing versions of ourselves for so long, we'd forgotten who we actually were. Yesterday, he'd found me at my easel, frustrated with a landscape that wasn't working. The trees looked flat, lifeless. I'd been about to give up, paint over it, start something safer. Show me? He'd asked. I had, expecting dismissal or polite disinterest. That's what I'd trained myself to expect from him. Instead, he'd studied it carefully. The same focused attention he probably gave his research data. Then pointed to the tree line. What if the light is coming from here instead? He'd asked. You mentioned once. I think it was at the Hendersons' dinner. How morning light transforms things. How it comes in at an angle and suddenly everything looks different, more alive. Could you show that transformation here? He'd listened. Remembered something I'd said weeks ago. Something I hadn't even realized I'd said. Offered genuine engagement instead of empty praise or dismissive criticism. I'd stared at the painting with new eyes, seeing what he meant. And later, when I added that angled morning light, the trees suddenly had dimension, depth, life. It's beautiful, James had said when I showed him the finished piece. You're really good at this, Emily. Not. That's nice, dear. Not a polite acknowledgement meant to end the conversation, but genuine appreciation, seeing me not as his wife who took up space in the kitchen, but as a person who created things, who had skills and vision and value beyond my relationship to him. I'd cried a little bit, there at my easel. James had looked alarmed, asked if something was wrong. No, I'd said. Something is finally right. Now, hearing him in the kitchen, making coffee for both of us, humming something under his breath, I realized something had shifted in me, too. The dread that usually accompanied waking, the immediate mental inventory of social obligations, the bracing for another day of performing Emily Williams, friendly neighbor, had lifted. I wasn't dreading today. I was looking forward to it. To the botanical gardens with James, where we'd each see different things and share them. Where he'd tell me Latin names and pollination strategies, and I'd point out color combinations and the way light filtered through leaves, and both kinds of knowing would matter. Neither better nor worse, just different ways of seeing the world. To lunch with the Patels and the Hendersons, where I might actually share something real about myself, instead of just facilitating everyone else's conversations. Where I could be Emily, complex and flawed and still learning, instead of Emily Williams, the cheerful one. To this evening, when James and I would probably attempt another pottery session. We were both terrible at it, but we laughed about our misshapen bowls and lopsided vases, laughed together at ourselves without judgment or criticism. Everyone had thought James needed healing after retirement. They'd looked at me with sympathy, as if I was the caretaker for a broken man, the long-suffering wife who'd stayed despite everything. But I was the one who'd been broken. Broken by loneliness so profound, I'd forgotten what connection felt like. By years of shallow socializing that left me emptier than solitude. By believing I wasn't worth genuine love or attention, that my purpose was to show up and smile, and never ever ask for more. By forgetting that I could choose differently, that I deserved to choose differently. James had needed to learn that life existed beyond work, that his value as a human being wasn't tied to his productivity or professional achievements. I'd needed to learn that life existed beyond survival, that I could risk real connection, could say no to what depleted me, and yes to what nourished me, could stop performing and start living. We were learning together now. Two people who'd been married for decades, but were only now discovering what that could mean. What it meant to be partners instead of roommates, companions instead of polite strangers, to choose each other daily instead of just staying out of habit or fear. The bedroom door opened softly. James stood there with 2 cups of coffee, steam curling up between us. His hair was uncombed, silver in the morning light. He was wearing the reading glasses that made him look distinguished and slightly lost at the same time. The ones I'd helped him pick out last week when he'd finally admitted he could barely read the newspaper anymore. "Good morning," he said. "I wasn't sure if you were awake. I made coffee. I hope I got it right this time." I sat up, accepting the cup. The coffee was perfect. The right amount of cream, heated to exactly the temperature I preferred, in my favorite mug. Small details, carefully observed. Evidence of attention, of care, of someone learning how to show love through the mundane rituals of daily life. "It's perfect," I said. "Thank you." "The garden's open at 10, he said, settling on the edge of the bed. "But there's no rush. We could have breakfast first. Or just sit here for a while. Just sit. Together. Present. Not rushing to the next obligation, the next performance, the next thing that needed to be done." "That sounds perfect," I said, and meant it with my whole heart. He smiled. A real smile, not the distracted grimace I'd gotten used to over the years. Then he did something unexpected. He took off his reading glasses, set down his coffee cup, and reached for my hand. "I was thinking," he said slowly, "that I never really thanked you. For not leaving. For building a life here, even when I wasn't part of it. For keeping the door open even when I'd basically walked out." "James." "No, let me finish." His grip tightened on my hand. "You had every right to divorce me, to decide you'd wasted enough years on a man who couldn't see past his own microscope. But you didn't. And now I get this second chance, this opportunity to actually know you. Really know you, not just share a house and a last name." "I thought about it," I admitted quietly. "Leaving. Probably 100 times. But I didn't want to admit failure. Didn't want to be alone officially, instead of just in practice. And somewhere deep down, I guess I still hoped you'd come back. Really come back, not just visit between experiments." "I'm back now," he said. "And I'm not leaving again. Not unless you want me to." "I don't want you to," I whispered. I want what we're building now. This version of us that's finally honest about what we want and need." He leaned over and kissed my forehead, something he hadn't done in so many years I'd forgotten he used to do it. "Then that's what we'll build. Together." We sat there for a long moment, holding hands in the morning light, our coffee growing cool beside us. Starting over, or maybe starting for the first time. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I wasn't already planning my exit from the moment, wasn't mentally rehearsing the next performance. I was here, with this man I'd married and lost, and was slowly finding again. I was here in my own life, finally looking forward to tomorrow with all its uncertain, genuine, beautifully ordinary possibilities. Not because I had to be, not because I was afraid to be alone, not because I was performing Emily Williams, the woman who shows up, but because I wanted to be. Because this life, messy and imperfect and still being figured out, was finally truly mine. And that was worth showing up for.